we'll be looking at the name of God, and we'll actually be starting a new series. I thought I'd start with a little story, which may illustrate some of the aspects of what we'll be talking about during this lesson. And it goes like this. An elderly couple were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. The husband kept calling his wife by pet names like honey, sweetie, dearest, sunshine, and so forth. Those present remarked on how passionate and vibrant their love had remained all these years. Later, the husband was chatting with one of his old friends, who commented on what they had all noticed. Well, yes, he said, I do love her, but the truth is that for the last 10 years I haven't been able to remember her real name. Now, if you don't understand the relevance of this little story or joke to a course on the name of God, it will become clear presently as we go through the material. I thought I would share one more story before we start looking at the name of God itself. And this is one of my favorite stories from ancient Chinese philosophy. So it goes like this. Once upon a time, Zhuangzi dreamed that he was a butterfly fluttering about enjoying itself. It did not know that it was Zhuangzi. Suddenly, he awoke with a start, and he was Zhuangzi again. But he did not know whether he was Zhuangzi who had dreamed that he was a butterfly, or whether he was a butterfly now dreaming that he was Zhuangzi. Between Zhuangzi and the butterfly, there must be some distinction. Now, again, the direct relevance of this particular story to the question of the name of God might not be immediately apparent. But just keep this in mind. So the first part of what we'll look at is the kind of obvious question, what is God's name? You have it written on the next slide, 4 Hebrew letters. But there is the name of God as it's written in modern Hebrew letters, or square block Hebrew letters, as they're called. They've been used for about the last 2,000 years, a bit more. If we were to give the names of the letters, we would say Yud, He, Vav, He. As some of you probably recognize, or in English transliteration, it's often written YHWH, and you'll see that quite a lot as we go through the slides. Now, because this name has 4 Hebrew letters, it's referred to as the Tetragrammaton, which is a way of saying 4 letters, or the name of 4 letters. And the reason that it's referred to in this way, in various other ways as well, is because in general it's not pronounced. Now, there are some people who do pronounce it or think they know how to pronounce it, and we'll get to that issue a little bit later. But it's very hard to talk about a word or name that you can't actually pronounce, and so people use all kinds of other words to refer to it, like the Tetragrammaton. Now, since we're just beginning, we're looking at God's name in the context of the Bible. It appears in the Hebrew Bible a number of times, and then this will also be relevant when we look forward in history to, let's say, the followers of Jesus or Yeshua. We should consider how they might have thought about the name of God or used it. But we'll start in the Hebrew Bible, and so that gives us a particular context, and some points should be made about that context. So first of all, names and their meanings are significant in the Bible. In many cases, the names of individuals are very connected to their lives, whether good or bad. You know, there's some kind of well, first of all, let's just say there's some kind of meaning in the name in virtually all cases that can be discerned linguistically. But secondly, that particular meaning of the name often has a great significance for whatever story is told about that particular person's life. Now, the same thing, in a sense, is true of God's name in the Bible, because God is a character that appears in this drama. He has a story, or there are stories that are told about him and his interactions with people. So his name, it's likely, has a particular meaning that we're supposed to recognize, and that may even be related to the stories that are told about him. So the stories that are told about God, in this case. Now, to just emphasize that point, I think probably many of you will be familiar with this idea already. Some people even receive new names with new meanings related to their life and purpose. For example, Avram received the new name Avraham. Yaakov received the new name Yisrael. And if you read the text of Genesis, you can see that these new names that they received were explicitly designed to suit a kind of new stage in their lives. And not only in their lives, but in fact, in both these cases, the impact that their lives would have on many future generations. Avraham was to signify that this man would be the father of many nations, a multitude of nations, something that could only happen in the future. And Yisrael was to become the name of a nation as well that had a particular relationship with El, God. So that's just a very, very brief summary, but it's something that we should keep in mind as we look at God's name, which is one of the names in the Bible. So it fits into this context. So how do we know that this is God's name? Where do we get these 4 letters? And why do we call this God's name as opposed to anything else when we read of many names for God, or many titles for God at least? Not to mention the word that means God that I just mentioned, El, means God. So why don't we call that God's name? Well, let's look at a few verses and it will become clear. So it says Ani, and then that means I. Here's the first word, Ani. And then this is the tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He. U Shmi, it is my name. So that's a very simple and direct statement. Ani in Hebrew usually say Adonai, usually read a substitute name Adonai, but let me say Yud He Vav He instead. Ani Yud He Vav He. Those are the 4 letters. U Shmi. So I am Yud He Vav He. That is my name. It's a very direct statement. This comes from the prophet Isaiah, as you can see. And it continues, and I shall not give my glory to another, nor my praise to idols. So this is a very interesting verse. And again, we're just taking a very brief excerpt. We could look at the entire context and discover much more. But notice that in this verse already we have certain elements. First of all, we find out what the name of God is. This 4-letter name, Yud He Vav He, the tetragrammaton. And somehow it's connected also to this idea that this God will not share his glory with any other God. Idols will not receive praise. So we should ask ourselves, what is the connection? What's the connection between this name? We don't know the meaning yet, but there's probably a meaning that we're supposed to discern. What's the connection between the meaning of that name and the fact that this is the name of God, and not sharing glory with other gods or allowing idols to have any praise? So that's an important question. Let's look at another verse. And it says, I'll read the relevant portion. Well, let me read it first in English, I guess. Here, this is from Exodus. And God said further to Moses, thus shall you speak to the Israelites, Yud He Vav He, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever, and my remembrance in every generation. So again, we have that statement that this is my name. Not just El, God, or Elohim, another word that's translated as God, but he says, Ze Shmi Leolam, forever or for ages, for eternity. Veze Zichri Ledol Dol. So this is my how I am remembered to generation and generation. So again, a very direct statement about what seems to be a personal name. So what are the additional elements that we get out of this verse? Again, aside from the confirmation that this is the particular name of God. Number one, this Yud He Vav He, this particular God with this particular name is associated with the God of your fathers, speaking to Israel. In other words, the same God that spoke to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And moreover, that refers us to the Genesis stories, because we know that that particular God is the creator of the universe. And once again, it emphasizes the importance of this name, saying that it will be forever or for eternity or for age or something like that, and for generation after generation. These are really interesting aspects. We've only looked at 2 simple verses, but we see very directly something about the name of God and some kind of associated elements. If we look at a third verse, in Hebrew, it says ki ani, for I. Yud-He-Vav-He, for I. You could translate am, Yud-He-Vav-He, or just I, comma, let's say Yud-He-Vav-He, Elohechem, your God, the God of you, speaking to Israel. So, for I, if we go to English now, for I, Yud-He-Vav-He, am your God. You shall sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not make yourselves unclean by any swarming thing that moves upon the earth. Now, this is really interesting because this is in the chapter that talks about food laws, and it emphasizes the name of God as a reason for the food laws that are given to Israel. And so there are certain practical implications of this name and of its meaning. And the food laws themselves stem from this idea of holiness or sanctification, or we don't have a very good equivalent perhaps in English for the Hebrew meaning, but being set apart for a particular purpose. So God says that he's set apart. Perhaps that has something to do with the distinction God makes between himself and any other gods or any other entities that are worshipped as gods. So he's set apart. He's different from all those other entities, whatever they may be. And the people of God, Israel, is supposed to also be set apart. And one of the practical implications of that, which again, it seems to kind of flow from the idea of the name to being set apart, to practical implications are some of these food laws. Now, this name, Yud-He-Vav-He, appears more than 6,000 times in the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible. That's quite a lot. So we have perhaps not 6,000 stories exactly, but we have a lot of stories in which this character appears, and obviously he's the most important character in the entire Bible. So if there's a meaning to the name, we should try to discern it. We've seen 3 verses so far, which already tell us that the name is somehow connected to, first of all, exclusive glory and praise, not sharing with any idol or any other claimed God. Secondly, the patriarchs of Israel, the Genesis stories, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and what we read in Genesis before that, which is the creation of the world and of all the earth. And thirdly, being set apart and not eating certain animals. Now, these are only 3 aspects from 3 particular verses I've chosen, but you could look at all 6,000 and you'd probably find some other interesting connections to the name as well. So we must ask ourselves, as we embark on this journey of trying to understand the meaning and significance of the name of God, what is it? How is it pronounced? What does it mean? And how can it convey such an array of understandings? How can it lead to so many different implications, apparently, in the biblical stories?